Welcome, everyone, to this week's Citizens Climate Training Program. It's a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'll be your host tonight, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is the 2024 Election Engagement Strategy, how a CCL is helping climate voters elect climate champions. Throughout this year already, CCL is engaged in a variety of ways to make sure more climate voters are voting. And we want climate to be a key issue for every candidate in every election. So joining me tonight are CCL staff and volunteers for a training that's going to discuss options that are available for all of us in the 2 remaining months as of today, 2 months to Election Day, to engage locally and nationally on the many events and outreach opportunities with especially our Election Engagement Action Team. And if you haven't yet checked out what the amazing work that they're doing, that is the biggest takeaway that we have from tonight's training, is that's really Ground Central, Ground Zero, Central Station, you name it, for all the activity that people are leading. All right, so you're going to be hearing a lot from me for the first half, and then we're going to be lining up a great stable of CCL volunteers and staff. We'll be hearing first after me from June Jesselin, our fellow from the Great Lakes and North Winds regions. We'll also hear from the amazing Stephanie Mungia, our Student Engagement Director, as well as the amazing Debbie Chang, CCL's Alabama Group Leader and EVP employee these days. And if I've done my job well, hopefully you're going to be walking away with a chance to just having had the opportunity to explore more about why we are engaging in elections in the first place. We'll have the chance to share examples of what CCL volunteers have been up to this election cycle. And you'll feel a little bit more grounded, like Ellie's put here in the chat, with actions that you and your chapter can keep taking here in these pivotal 60 days remaining between now and Election Day. And in order for us to do that, we're going to have the chance to talk a little bit more again, first and foremost, about the question, why is CCL engaging? We'll talk through some of the public voter outreach materials and strategy we have, as well as the importance of getting CCLers to vote. We'll be hearing about the amazing Climate Go campaign that Stephanie and her team and Sharon and her team have been putting together. And then we'll have the chance to think through some other additional candidate engagement strategies, since this is a full court press. How can we show up to make sure climate continues to be on the campaign trail for everyone running? All right, so without further ado, though, thank you all so much for being here. And if there is one takeaway from tonight's training, like I've already highlighted in the chat, it's that we would love for anyone interested after tonight to get plugged in, if you're not already, with CCL's election engagement work for the remainder of the election season ahead by going to cclusa.org/election engagement. And it's a suitable name because really, CCL is strategically engaging in elections because who gets elected matters. We know that people that are in office are making the laws, and we are ultimately lobbying them when we work with Congress or your state and local governments. And electing more climate supporters in those seats means passing more climate legislation as well as lowering emissions. We also know this: candidates pay attention to voters, and especially likely voters, active and vocal voters. And this is a chance for all of us to make sure that our voices are heard, that the priorities that we have are being factored into the races that we are seeing unfold in front of us, and to amplify the voices that we know of millions of people out there that are supporting climate action is really a top-tier issue. We know that candidates and elected officials, we'll see a couple of slides from Environmental Voter Project in just a bit, often tend to underestimate support for climate action. So this is really the opportunity and the time for us to engage them directly on the campaign trail and to make sure that they keep on hearing about climate, that it's a high priority in polling, and that they do increasingly then pay attention to it during their campaigns. We also know that candidates can pay attention to organizations that show they help turn out the vote. Elected officials listen to their constituents and allies, but especially when they feel that those allies are critical to their electoral success or engaging in the general public to participate in democracy by showing that we can turn out voters. CCL more broadly has a chance to have more clout in our lobby efforts. And we also know that educating, persuading, and engaging people in our communities is key right now in election season, right? It's not just about us and our volunteers, it's about outside of that in our communities. This is an opportunity to raise awareness, persuade friends, family, fellow community members about the importance of climate action, and really, using that, you can, have an opportunity to recruit people to CCL's work, but these can also be one-time conversations and actions to ultimately lead towards the main call to action of voting, right? That's the main thing that we want people to show up. And how we're doing this all matters too, right? So core to who CCL's identity is that we are trying to create an inclusive and welcoming space for people across the political spectrum who want to solve climate change. And if we get partisan, we can alienate people in our groups or turn people off who want to join us. So another key benefit of CCL's approach of staying nonpartisan in our election engagement work is that it supports our relationships with whoever wins, right? We've all been in districts or in races where, clearly one side or then the other is win. And after the election over, you're going to be lobbying whoever is ultimately the winner of the election. So it's really good to be able to have played on both sides of the election engagement, to have developed that relationship ahead of the actual election results, and to start on the right foot, to be clear that, while you were working to elevate climate in the election, you were not campaigning against a particular candidate. Key to our strategy for durable climate policy, we also know that promoting climate as an election issue across the political spectrum is going to be key too, so that we have elected leaders in all parties feeling compelled by their voters to take climate action. This is going to increase our durability. It's going to make sure that legislation isn't likely to be repealed. And it's also required of us as a nonprofit, right? We as CCL are not allowed by law to advocate for specific candidates. So as individuals, you are free to do as you wish, but you always want to make sure to take your CCL hat off when you're actually advocating for a specific candidate. That's not the kind of work that we as CCL volunteers can do, and we really mean it. Given the polarization that our overall country is seeing right now, people might see engaging on climate as partisan. So we have to work extra hard to make sure that we're truly being nonpartisan and open to everyone who is a climate supporter. So with all of that kind of context and background, I'm going to put a few links here in the chat. And, a couple of things that people might be curious about outside of the election engagement action team of what we've done in the past. If you have already taken advantage of this too, I'd love to hear about this, because I love hearing stories like, what Carol, Ellie, and others have been up to with the amazing postcard efforts that you've been doing. We have an election season tabling kit. I'll show you what that looks like in just a bit. We also have an amazing social media kit. We have a guide that we'll get into in the second half, all about town hall and candidate forum advice on how to show up and make climate election issue. We have get out the vote email and text messages and recommended scripts. And we also have the opportunity to even have yard signs, billboards, and swag. So here's a lot of the stable of tabling materials that we have. We have an election season flyer that you're looking at right here. We have voter registration flyers that you can customize with your state's specific information. It was especially relevant in the primaries. You can now update that if you want to make it more personal based on where you live for the general election. We have a volunteer with environmental voter project flyer and reminders, on social media and for handouts about the general election. And in addition to that, here's some of that social media content that I talked about, including registration deadlines, reminders about primary voting. I know a lot of chapters were active ahead of their overall state primaries. And we now have general election reminders, as well as I'm a climate voter cool swag too. And you can see that it's not only present in social media, but you've got it in stickers, in merchandise like shirts, in bumper stickers. We've even had some volunteers use this on an upscale vector-based graphic and create billboards. I know even in rural Minnesota, we've had that. So if you are interested in that and have yet to hear about that after tonight, please feel free to reach out if you'd like to do that between now and the election too. So we're going to talk a little bit about, the closer partnership we've had with EVP this year. We have already had a bigger emphasis this year, especially thanks ahead of the primary season, to the work that Tony Cerna, our former VP of Organizational Strategy, put in to really emphasizing the primaries across the country, and CCL chapters to be active in making sure people are registered and voting there. And then we also did a postcarding pilot across the country that I'll briefly talk about here in just a little bit too. And so that really kind of aligns with the main actions that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I'd like to talk a little bit about EVP, I'd like to talk about, I'd actually pass it to Debbie then to talk a little bit about CCL supporter outreach. And I'd also like to make sure that we hear from Stephanie on the importance of the Climate GOAT campaign, Get Out the Vote via the Climate GOAT, greatest of all time, an acronym there. And then we'll close with some candidate engagement discussion. But before anything else, what I'm actually going to do is just pass it to June, who has been just an incredible asset and very active, not only with Wisconsin and the overall kind of Great Lakes North Wind efforts, but also as a phone bank leader and one of the election engagement action team's tech for our phone bank nights. Here's just a chance to hear a 1-minute interview with June about what he's been a big fan of with the election engagement work that CCL's been up to. So I'll pass it to you, June.
I'm June Gasteland, he, him pronouns. This year will be my first time voting in a presidential election. Throughout 2024, I've focused on engaging in get out the vote efforts, especially through phone banking. I've led trainings on phone banking and helped lead the CCL Wisconsin phone banking team in our climate voter campaign. You can join future phone banks by going to the events page of the Election Engagement Action Team on CCL Community on Wednesday nights, or go to environmentalvoter.org. Personally, I love phone banking with CCLers in these EVP CCL sessions because phone banking can get a little tough sometimes, but sharing that tough experience with others makes me feel like I am part of a closer community.
Thank you very much, June. That's a perfect example of just why, obviously, this is the shared work that we're engaged in with the Election Engagement Action Team. And just as a reminder, we've already put that link in the chat, but you can simply go to cclusa.org/election-engagement. And there you'll find everything that June referenced, as well as a lot of resources that I've already led through talking about here. All right, so let's talk briefly about a little bit more background on the Environmental Voter Project. I know that in just the last month, Nathaniel Stinnett, the executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, he's been on a media circus interviews circuit. And he was actually just on one of my favorite podcasts, Volts. David Roberts just interviewed him as well as producing a TED Talk here in just the last little bit. So EVP has definitely been in the cultural zeitgeist of late. There's a link to that interview on Volts that Nathaniel did. And again, the whole premise here that EVP is trying to identify and then work through with a goal and the identification of the problem is that we know that traditionally this is still a surprise for a lot of people. Environmentalists actually vote less often than the general public. So there's a direct causal relationship with climate ending up being lower on voter priority polling because they're just not being engaged as active voters as much. You can kind of see here based on kind of the percentage of people that say each of these issues should be the top priority for President and Congress. The goal then is to change the electorate so that climate shows up as a higher priority among regular voters. And EVP has a virtuous cycle here that basically is really meant to kickstart this process across the country and making more and more happen. They reach out to registered voters who are likely to be environment first voters. They have a unique algorithm that they don't share how they kind of identify those people, but they're very confident that that is kind of one of the top priorities for these voters. And they then use that chance to create a social kind of peer-based influence campaign with phone calls, postcards. There used to be text banks. They're trying out deep canvassing, door knocking to really use not only the general election, but each election cycle, primaries, local candidates, you name it, as an opportunity to really flex your civic duty and turn them into regular voters, from unlikely voters to regular voters. And then as a result, there's going to be more environmentalist voting. There's going to be more political focus on this issue, and then more legislation will pass as a result. So for this cycle, the 2024 elections, EVP's main kind of focus is on these 19 states. All of the targets across these almost 5 million voters that we've been helping with phone banking and engaging with postcarding, et cetera, are targets that are registered to vote, highly likely to list climate as one of their top priorities, but unlikely to vote in the presidential election without that extra nudge. So it's kind of a very targeted and strategic list to focus on. And again, as June highlighted, the way that we're really going about this is weekly Wednesday phone banking with EVP. You don't need any training or experience. We'd love to have you. This last week, over 80 CCLers were on. And so it's becoming a bigger and bigger phenomenon. And I know, up into the election is probably going to continue to grow. So they can use as many people as they can. And the program they use, Hub Dialer, actually is more efficient. The more people making calls, they can connect everyone on the line even quicker. Somehow that's how the technology works. So it's actually to our benefit to turn out in droves. So that's EVP. We also this year have been doing a pilot. It's kind of no longer active, but leading through the primaries and then here to the general election, CCL state coordinators across the country signed up to do postcarding. And what CCL National then was provided a list of names, instructions, and postcards, and then the local chapters paid for the postage end of it. And through that shared effort, we collectively generated over 140,000 postcards throughout the country that were sent this spring and summer. So thank you to every one of you that were a part of that. I know EVP also had their own postcarding efforts. And this was in addition to that. It was so popular, we're going to try to roll out even more opportunities next cycle with that. But again, great pilot this year that generated a lot of success in the outreach. And you can see one of the designs. This was from actually our last election cycle, but it was very similar to this one as well. So what I'm actually going to do next is pass it. We've heard from June. I'm going to pass it to both Stephanie and Debbie now to talk about two other approaches outside of our election engagement work that, especially if you have young adults, or especially if you'd like to do a bit more work in your own local chapter, I'd love to kind of feature what they've been up to and innovating on both the higher ed and youth action team. So we'll start hearing first from Stephanie, the amazing work that our young adults are doing with the climate vote campaign here. So here is Stephanie.
Thank you so much. All right. So Stephanie Mungia, for those of you who don't know me, but on a broader CCL level, I'm our student engagement director. And that means I spend all of my time thinking about some of the questions that Lily has grappled with in developing that program, which is what can we do to really motivate students to get involved and to take action? And typically that means how do we get them to take action on climate, but it's an election year. So of course we are pivoting our focus to making sure that they're taking action around the election. And the way we're doing that is we have co-developed, I say we, in reference to our higher education action team and our national youth action team. We've co-developed this climate goat campaign. The full name is Be the Climate Goat, Get Out the Climate Vote. And this is a collaborative effort to leverage the power of youth voices. So slightly different, although related to some of the work that Lily was just sharing. What we're working on is getting our young CCL volunteers to stimulate conversations in their communities about how to vote with the climate in mind in this election, really telling them that they're voting for our future. So whether we're under 18 and aren't eligible to vote ourselves just yet, or are over 18 and voting in our first elections, we want to make sure that people know that the future is what's on the line, and we're the best advocates to speak about that because we're the ones who are going to be living it, whatever the outcome is. So we have a couple of major aims in this campaign. The first one is to persuade existing voters to prioritize climate change as a voting issue if they don't already do so. So this is just reminding them to really vote with their values, and the power of a youth voice in this context is to remind them that as young people, we're the ones who are going to inherit a climate changed future. And for people who are perhaps in our lives who deeply care about us, like grandparents or parents, that can be a really persuasive argument to be reminded, like, oh, it's true, I hadn't thought about climate being such a priority, but I'm voting in a way that is going to directly impact your ability to live a full and healthy life. We're also working to mobilize voters who might already care about climate change but aren't currently planning on voting. This gets at some of the motivation that I think Lily's work gets to, which is really connecting the dots for people and making them realize what an incredible privilege and power it is to be able to vote, to be able to decide on our future in this way that we get to do in a democracy. In addition, we are adding a recruitment piece to this because we are adapting from relational organizing. So after our young volunteers speak with voters, they also recruit some of those people that they've discussed this issue with to become volunteers themselves. So particularly for our students to reach their peers and encourage them to also get involved in the GOAT campaign. Now, I mentioned we're adapting from relational organizing. We're also adapting from something called deep canvassing, which is a conversation method that allows you to go really deep and connect to the emotional stakes of an issue. And it's been found to be highly effective, not only in persuading voters, but also in creating messages that really stick. If I just shouted a bunch of climate change facts at you all on the call, even those of you who are already very passionate about climate change, it probably wouldn't be very motivational. But if I walk you through a process of discovering how climate change is already impacting your own life or the lives of people you care about, that's more likely to stick with you as a message and to be much more resonant. So in a deep canvassing conversation, we are still all about data. So we're actually going to start our conversation with understanding where somebody is already in their thinking about climate and voting and where those align or don't. Then we get into sharing that story, really getting into the emotional stakes, and both the volunteer and the voter will share their story. In the third step, we're making the case, helping those folks who maybe do have a climate change impact story that they're not quite connecting the dots to the need for action on. So maybe they shared a story about the lake house that they used to go to with their family every summer, and how it's being impacted by erosion of the bank, and more increased storms, like the summer weather just isn't as pleasant. Maybe they're not making the connection about how those impacts of climate change can be mitigated through government climate action, and therefore can be mitigated by electing the right people into positions of power. We also work with them to process any conflict they might be feeling. Things that we hear from young people in particular a lot are things like, well, climate of course is important, but so are a million other things that are really important to me in this election year. Issues like racial justice, issues like current conflicts around the world and how that is impacting their livelihoods. All of those types of conflicts are totally valid. So we want to make sure that we validate them and also help them to see how those can be really deeply interconnected with climate issues. Racial justice is climate justice. There are so many different ways that our work intersects. In the fifth step, we wrap up our conversation, kind of remind them of where we've been on this emotional journey together. And it does get very emotional. I have cried in some of these conversations. And we ask them again, how important do you think climate is as a voting issue for you? And in true CCL fashion, we wrap up with thanking them for their time, and we make a couple of asks, a couple of opportunities for them to immediately take action. So this is a really great opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody who kind of walks them through this entire process of recognizing an issue and how it's impacting them directly, working through all of the reasons, all the barriers that might get in your way from being a climate voter, and immediately having an opportunity to do something about it. How it's going so far, we've had over 100 student volunteers who have signed up. They've had more than 500 conversations since April when we launched. We also have more than 2,000 new people that they're contacting. So the whole point of this is to really amplify your power by reaching out to more people. So those students are doing a great job of bringing new people into the conversation. And we are constantly growing. So every single month we have mini challenges that we are encouraging people to partake in. And we're also learning from the feedback we're getting from our volunteers about how we can change it. And one of the biggest points of feedback that we received is that our original script that we created, which I'll share a link to in just a second, it is lengthy. It is not something that you have to read word for word, sort of like Lily demonstrated today. There's so much more context we can provide, but not every conversation requires it. Not every audience needs it. However, it was a barrier to entry for a lot of our younger volunteers who felt like it was just overwhelming. They also wanted to connect in a different way and sort of pivot from reaching out to our parents and grandparents, these older folks in our lives who care about us, to reaching out to their peers, because the Gen Z vote is critical to any election, but especially to this election based on all of the data that I've seen so far. And this led us to create this AHA script. So AHA stands for Anger, Hope, and Action. So we start by really validating and meeting young people where they're at, which is often really severe frustration about government inaction on climate change. This is an emotion we don't often spend a lot of time with in CCL because we're optimists. We try to stay away from those kind of heavier, trickier emotions, but they're very present in the minds of a lot of young people. So we get them there, we get them to feel that frustration. And then we remind them that there is a lot of hope. We share examples of where government climate action is already having an impact, where elected officials are taking climate positive steps, and help them to understand, again, connecting those dots, that their vote will directly lead to government climate action if they're electing the right people and voting with the climate in mind. And once again, we end on action. We always end on action here at CCL. We want to mobilize them right away so that they're reclaiming their power in our democracy and getting registered to vote and helping other people also access that opportunity. So if you want to learn more about this campaign, the absolute best place you can go to, a single link, is cclusa.org/climate-goat. So I just put that in the chat. If you are a young person yourself and you want to volunteer, you can use that Be the Goat link that you see on the screen in step 1. I also invite you to check out our script. Like I said, this is the link to the longer version, but it also includes a link to that new AHA script if you want to check out what that shorter version looks like. And there's tons of guidance in there. If you want to apply them, and the script is written from the perspective of a young person. We've gotten a lot of questions from older volunteers who also want to get involved. If you would like to do that, you are totally welcome to use the script, adapt it, and start having some conversations with the folks in your life too about climate and voting. And if you have questions, please reach out to me and the rest of the elections team. It consists of volunteers from our youth action team, and our higher ed action team. We've got Druhi, Marwan, Shamak, Gigi, Isla, and June, and it seems like every day more people want to get involved, and we could not do it without them. So please feel free to reach out to all of us at that one email address.
That is exactly what we wanted to hear on the Climate Go campaign. And I know that obviously people probably have more questions on that. And so for just a little bit, I'm going to pass it to Debbie to just talk a little bit more actually about another strategy in getting out the CCL vote. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Debbie.
So as you recall, part of CCL's mission is to enable breakthroughs in personal and political power. And back during November Lobby Day, Vice President of Government Affairs, Ben Pendergrass, mentioned one reason we didn't have the Energy Innovation Act as a primary ask was because we needed to build more support at home. And how better to let Congress know that people support climate solutions than to make sure CCL members are all voting at the primaries, right? So this idea is for the folks where the barrier to voting isn't the willingness and desire to vote, but the logistics or time, like working out exactly how to walk through the voter registration process, making the time to read, review, and research the ballot. And this is where a ballot research party comes in. For some people, it helps with accountability. For others, it's something to do, fun to do in community. So they need a dedicated time and space to sit, read the ballot, figure out a voting plan for when, where, and how you're going to vote. And your chapter can host a ballot research party for this. So I'm going to share some toolkits in a minute, but basically timing, aim for a day after the sample ballots become available in your area, and preferably before your state's registration deadline. So for maximum interest, do it before the presidential primaries registration deadline. And so check your local dates. Ask your attendees to bring, and maybe have a few extra on hand, sample ballots, voter guides, and websites for the election information. So make sure there's internet access. If it's in person, make it fun. Bring food, bring snacks. It makes it festive. You can also decorate or invite people to dress in a red, white, and blue theme. And you can set some norms. So remind everyone that CCL welcomes people across the political spectrum. So make sure to respect the different political ideologies in the room. If your chapter wants to discuss the candidates, you can also invite attendees beforehand to research a particular office or ballot measure and lead that discussion with what they found. When you're host, try to make sure everyone gets to participate and nobody is dominating the conversation. Take notes. For example, in one of our events, we made a shared Google document where we threw all the voter registration details, the candidate websites, external voter guides for a district like Ballotpedia or newspaper endorsements. And then we shared those resources afterwards with the rest of our chapter who didn't attend. So here's some hosting toolkits that we'll copy into the chat. They're also on the slide deck notes along with a few extra resources. The goal is to make it easier to vote by having a dedicated time to do it together. The secondary goal as a chapter is to build a sense of community, make it fun so people want to vote and do other activities again in the future. which will lead to political power as individuals and as a chapter. I'm always trying to think of ways to re-engage the roster, and to use CCL pyramid of engagement parlance, this is a really low barrier event in action that works really well for joiners or people who only have the time to join events occasionally. Who says voting isn't fun? Let's bring the joy of voting to our CCL chapter. And having a community centered on civic engagement could be a way to increase participation. So this is another idea. It's a little more advanced, but it's worth doing. If you're a chapter leader, you have access to your chapter roster. And how many of them vote? Even when environmentalists and CCLers know that it's important, maybe they move districts and don't get around to registering at their new address, or they're busy and didn't get around to reading their ballot. Maybe the active group members have, but the roster probably hasn't. So those are really warm leads. If you participated in 2021 to the phone banking for CCLers for the Inflation Reduction Act, remember how easy it was to talk to our own people? And especially if you have chapter members who are volunteering with AVP phone banking, they've got a little bit of training and experience to call your chapter roster. So I took an AVP script and I adapted it for my chapter. I put in the registration and election dates. I did the frequently asked questions. I asked about their plan for voting and encouraged roster members to vote. And because we only intended to do a single pass-through, we also included scripts for voicemail and for text message or email. We let the volunteers choose the method that they wanted to use, as long as it was to individuals and not a mass email. And sometimes volunteers also, we were saying earlier, relational organizing, right? Family and friends. We let them use this time to reach out to their own friends and family and use these materials as a template. And they can adapt it to continue getting out the vote beyond CCL. So don't assume that because they're CCLers, they're all ready to vote. Sometimes we can all use a little gentle poke to think through a voting plan. So I personally know a CCL group leader who almost didn't vote, not just one time, but in 2016, when I was a campaign volunteer in a swing state, in 2018, after listening to Nathaniel Stinnett's talk, and in 2020. So remember what EVP says, while environmentalists will swear that it's very important to vote, they're notoriously poor voters. So don't leave any CCLers behind in this election. And as a bonus, if you're having a great conversation with somebody who's in CCL, invite them to your next CCL event. We did our phone banking prior to the ballot research party, so that's what we invited folks to next. So go and have fun re-engaging your chapter roster and getting your local environmentalists to vote.
Thank you, Debbie. What I'm going to do to close before going to Q&A here is just a quick reminder. I'll put again the slides that kind of Debbie showed for kind of the ballot access party, you name it, and the climate vote campaign are both now in the chat. And what I'd like to do just really quickly is, after talking about the get out the vote, just a reminder on town hall and candidate forums. These are really kind of instrumental opportunities for all of us. I know that a lot of them have already happened, but for those that are still tracking and kind of would like to make sure to show up and have these be another opportunity to make sure that climate is elevated. We have some amazing toolkits and trainings specifically on that. So if you're looking for a training on town halls, let me put a link to that in the chat. There's also some example questions you can utilize. And again, a couple of 5 quick reminders. The whole goal is to, attend to who your candidate and audience are. So those different questions kind of play to the strengths. If this is a red event, a purple event, a blue event, really speaking to the heart of the matter from each of those frames. You want to make sure that you're also not only showing up yourself, but getting other climate concerned friends, fellow volunteers, or community members to show up and consider wearing climate shirts, buttons, etc. Again, not CCL related, since this would be, something specifically, perceived as partisan, but the chance to really be able to kind of name climate as a top issue and include it in your Q&A. And then you also want to make sure to talk about climate directly with the candidate. Tell your climate story, why it's important to you, elevate the issue, don't get into policy, and then talk to other people at the event afterwards too. Use this as a chance to not only try to persuade the actual member of Congress or candidate running for the office, but also those attendees too. And if you're looking for an example of an amazing candidate forum, the CCL blog has actually featured several of them in the last year. Right. So, and we also know that, this is specific to forums. CCL chapters have hosted their own forums, both online or in person, or they've also, the main way that we're doing that these days is actually partnering with a group like UUAW or the League of Women Voters, or other nonpartisan groups that are really trying to provide candidate education opportunities. This can be for local or state or national elections. And again, the whole goal is being nonpartisan by inviting all viable candidates. You're not just going to be posting it for the Democratic candidates or just for the Republican candidates. You want to make sure the invite has been extended and invited to all people running for that office. And then as you're working with other groups, you can also make sure that they're considering climate questions. The last thing I'll highlight here before opening up the Q&A is if you're interested, we do also have some amazing resources for our print and broadcast media. So if you're looking to specifically generate news coverage, editorial endorsements on the importance of climate change, starting talking points on a letter to the editor, all that's available in our election media toolkit that the wonderful Flannery Winchester and Charlotte Ward put together. So check those out. You can reach out to them if you have any further questions as well. But the great news that I also would like to highlight is that we have already exceeded our goal. So back at the beginning of the year, we said that we'd like to, throughout the year, have generated up to 2,500 actions, all around election engagement activity. We actually crossed that number right after the conference, and we are now, with 60 days left, 3,670. So kudos to everyone that's been doing voter outreach. But obviously, thank you all for being here. And I do really look forward to hearing if there's any new kernels of ideas, whether it's a candidate forum or an opportunity to do kind of a get out the vote with your own local chapter party. Let us know what from tonight's training you were inspired to try out. And in the meantime, thank you each for the work that you're doing to lead your teams to making sure that climate continues to be an important election priority for the last 2 months. So stay safe, everyone, and I'll unmute all lines. Really appreciate seeing all of you tonight.
Thank you so much for your input. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.